We will be starting the webinar shortly. Hello, my name is Sharon Roberson. I'm President and CEO of the YWCA Nashville and Middle Tennessee. I welcome you to our Stand Against Injustice Lunch and Learn. We have a very exciting and very relevant topic today, transit to transformation. Thank you for joining us. This is part of our series, and we welcome you to not only visit with us today, but to also go on our YouTube site, and you can see previous conversations that we feel are relevant to this community. As with the YWCA, we always say we invite you to our conversations, and we do not indict individuals. We do not want you to feel as though if you have a question or concern, that is something that we take lightly. We want to make sure we educate the public, and that's why we have this as part of our advocacy platform. Now, last month we finished up what we have as an annual racial justice challenge, and we spent a week exploring how transportation connects to issues of racial justice. We are excited today to dig deeper into this topic in our webinar. We will discuss how transportation has been used as a tool to prevent the physical and economic well-being of marginalized communities, and how transportation can serve as a catalyst for inclusivity, justice, and empowerment for all. We will be remiss if we didn't thank the Nissan Foundation, Alliance Bernstein, and the Harnish Foundation, because they support this work, and by supporting this work, we are able to provide these relevant community conversations free of charge. We want to spark dialogue in the community. We want those in the community that participate in these webinars to have conversations within their groups and to help us understand and make Nashville the best place that it can be. Let's get started. I want to ask each of the panelists, give them the opportunity to introduce themselves. I'll start with you, Ashley.
Hello there, my name is Ashley Wilson, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator, as well as the Volunteer Coordinator and Bike Belly Coordinator for Walk Bike Nashville.
All right, Timothy.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you everyone who has allowed this opportunity and this conversation to be held today with the YW. My name is Timothy Hughes. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I work at the intersection of public policy and social justice with a group called the Center for Popular Democracy. A lot of the work that we do centers the voices and the concerns of individuals that are often left out of the discussion. And so I'm really excited that we're going to have this discussion, this conversation about transit and the ways in which we can create opportunities for communities that have been marginalized historically. Thank you so much for the invitation.
All right, Tanisha.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tanisha Hall. I'm the CEO and founding principal of Fairpoint Planning. Fairpoint Planning is a management consulting firm, and we focus on helping organizations, government organizations like a TDOT or an NDOT or a WeGo, develop long-range transportation plans that help determine where investments are made for the transportation system. I'm happy to be here and joining all of you today, so I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about transportation.
All right, good. Now, often we start these conversations in understanding history because we all know that we have to know our history to make sense of our present. But when we look at the civil rights movement, transportation pops up repeatedly. Whether we look at Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, or the Freedom Riders, public transportation was a central battleground. Why was transportation so important to these organizers, and what lessons can we take? I'll start with you, Timothy.
Thank you, Sharon, for that question. And I really appreciate the fact that we're starting in history because it has a lot to do with how it is that we get to the present moment, right? So we talk about the leadership that happened in the 60s and the civil rights movement with the bus boycotts, the efforts to move around and to have a system that actually respected the value of all human beings and the dignity of all human beings. But I think we have to go even further back when we start talking about the history of equity as it relates to transportation and how it is that bodies move around in our communities and in our world. We look at the civil rights movement, but if we go back even further to things like the aftermath of enslavement, individuals were required to have documents. If they were Black folks, they had to have documents in order to be able to move from one space to another space. Even when we envisioned freedom and liberation in this country, we described something called the Underground Railroad, right, as a way of being able to transport ourselves from one place to another. And so when we're talking about the ways in which Black and brown bodies are moving about in our country, we have to have a discussion about that history and how it is that those particular movements were policed, were controlled by the state, the policy that was involved in creating parameters by which individuals could move from one place to another. And so with that in mind, we understand then the role that historically, the ways in which we divided power, the ways in which policy was set up so that Black and brown bodies could not move with the same level of freedom and liberation as other bodies. Then we superimpose on that the understanding that we have around the ways in which infrastructure has been unequitably and unfairly distributed when we talk about things like redlining, when we talk about things like eminent domain, where land is seized by government agencies and people's livelihoods and businesses are transported or moved about. We talk about the history, for example, in North Nashville of the in the 1950s, when the construction projects that would bring our country together, creating the interstate highway system, were traditionally constructed in places like Black communities and brown communities, in this case of North Nashville, bifurcating a very thriving economic metropolitan area in North Nashville. And historically, those kinds of things have been significantly more damaging to communities of color. And so we have to have that historic context in which to be able to fit our contemporary conversation about investments in infrastructure and to really be able to talk about that in an informed way. Sharon, I think you may be muted.
Okay. Tanisha, you often advise governmental entities on transit issues. How important is this historic perspective to that advice?
It's extremely important. In order for us not to repeat those same issues, we need to know what has happened in the past in order to definitely improve upon that, the issues and the trauma that was placed on a lot of communities of color, and improve on how we engage people moving forward. How do we make sure that that voices are heard that typically aren't heard? How do we make sure that we have a diverse staff even working with the community, staff that could understand what's going on and empathize with the issues and have those issues resonate. You know, I'm originally from New Orleans, born and raised New Orleans, and you know the harms that the transportation system is just put on that city is just tremendous. You know, there are a host of case studies out there that talk about the different harms that transportation did to the city. And I also know that some of the benefits that I have received from different transportation systems, like using transit. I was a huge transit rider when I was growing up, and that allowed me to get around the city a little bit better. So knowing the past can definitely help you inform and improve upon the future for communities across this country.
Oh, all right. And Ashley, you have a different perspective. Walk Bike Nashville. How does this historic perspective affect your advocacy?
This historic aspect actually affects our advocacy a lot when it comes to one of the programming that we do, which is called Safe Routes to Schools. And historically speaking, especially as Tanisha mentioned, being from New Orleans, there is the Ruby Bridges Walk. And the biggest thing about the Ruby Bridges Walk is the fact that when it comes to schools, you know, she had an opportunity to go to a better school, but she had to walk to get there. And so when the abilities for even her safety in walking and doing that walk, the lack thereof, I should say, that speaks volumes to how infrastructure is sometimes delayed when it goes to being able to reach those more rural areas so that people in those spaces can get better opportunities for education and even jobs.
Oh, all right. Okay. Let's do a little bit more history before we get to where we are today, especially looking at the mayor's plan. But around the same time as landmark civil rights cases, Brown v. Board of Education that ordered America's desegregation in the schools, the federal government began using an unprecedented amount of funds to cities to redesign their local communities. And those of us of my age understand this is referred to as urban renewal. And these were policies that lasted from 1949 to 1974. Here at YWCA, our historical all-black blue triangle branch building on 5th and Gay was demolished in the early 1950s. And so there could be the municipal auditorium as well as 2 high-rise buildings. How did urban renewal reshape Nashville, and what did this have to do with race? Timothy, you touched on this a little bit. Can you give us a little bit more flavor to that?
Thank you, Sharon. I really think that the issue of urban renewal is probably one of the biggest issues that often goes unreported and undiscussed in conversations about infrastructure. The urban renewal program, which was designed to construct the infrastructure that would give opportunities for all members of the community to be able to have highways, to be able to move about in community and in society. But what often happened is through things like eminent domain, through things like redlining, which essentially categorize certain parts of communities as undesirable. And many of those communities were areas where working class, Black and brown and poor people lived and worked. And so what often would happen with urban renewal is there were efforts to construct, in much the same way as gentrification, which was mentioned here in the chat, the new version of urban renewal, which in some ways was the removal of Black and brown and indigenous people from their historic areas and community, and to replacing those areas and replacing the in those places, and by doing so, removing individuals who once lived there, it creates an environment where folks feel unwelcome. We create an environment where it's supposed to be designed for everyone, but some folks are considered to be less than, others are considered to be marginalized, unimportant and insignificant in the community, or at least are not valued as fully as other members of the community. And when that happens, right, we have a creation of a two-class or a multi-tiered system where some members of community are not treated with the same level of value and respect. And we see that reflected in our contemporary designs. We see that reflected in the ways in which we consider green spaces in certain communities. Whenever you look at your neighborhood and your community and there are more police stations than there are public parks, that's an indication of the ways in which people are valued, or the ways in which their bodies are seen, in certain ways. And so it's important that we understand that these decisions that are made with our public dollars, with our tax dollars, are public policy decisions that affect everyone. And if we don't ask the questions about whether or not there is affordable and accessible housing for all, if we aren't asking questions with regard to public transit about the investment in resources that are available to everyone, their disability, no matter their income, we're not asking the appropriate questions around what is equitable and fair and what is truly inclusive for members of our community. It's my understanding that when we start talking about things like transit, for example, if we don't have full investment in robust services that provide resources to folks, for example, who may have intellectual or physical disabilities, then are we really making sure that this process is fairly and equitably being distributed for all people in the community? If we're not asking questions about whether or not we're paying workers who are providing the resource and driving individuals from place to place a living wage so that they can live in the city that they service, are we truly being equitable and fair in our distribution? I don't want to control too much of the conversation, but as you were talking about urban renewal, it reminded me of a text that was written by a professor at Tennessee State University, Larotha Williams Jr. It says, "I'll take you there, exploring Nashville's social justice." In this book, it talks a lot about the ways in which urban renewal has underdeveloped Black and brown and working class communities. And in order for us to really have a fair and equitable system, we've got to make sure that we go back and we repair that harm that was done to so many of the communities in our city.
All right, well, going back to the 1950s and 60s and 70s urban renewal, Tanisha, it seems as though Nashville and Middle Tennessee as a whole is going through a revival of urban renewal, and that there are a lot of things being built, a lot of people being displaced. How do you feel as though the urban renewal of the past can be used as an example of what and what not to do in reshaping Nashville? You're muted. Yeah, I understand.
That mute button gets me every single time. One of the things I think we need to think about, again, I think Timothy hit the nail on the head with everything that he said. And one of the issues that we had back then in the past was our voices were not able to be heard. Even if we were out screaming on the mountaintop, we were not able to be heard. Since then, there have been a host of plans and programs from even on the federal level where there's, if you want to develop a project, you have to go through this process called NEPA. And during that process, it's part of the Environmental Protection Act. And part of that process is there's a screening that you have to do called environmental justice. And having that environmental justice screening, you're looking at the different impacts that are, what kinds of harms could be done potentially to people. And within these neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color, if there's an adverse impact to neighborhoods of color, that needs to be addressed. If there are adverse impacts to even different like wildlife and everything too, but just making sure that we are not adversely impacting neighborhoods and all the gentrification issues that are going through different communities. We want to make sure that we learn from the past, use these programs to our benefit, and make sure that we don't, again, we don't want to repeat any of the stuff that we did previously, because we've seen how it's separated families, separated communities, lack of opportunities, because now there's where there was like, you were free to move about the cabin, so to speak. You get boxed in, you have a fence on one side, an interstate on the other side, and you have a little sliver of land that you can even play in, and just the quality of life for people is severely diminished when you have programs like urban renewal coming in, and you're transforming different areas just for the sake of growth. But are you taking into account what's happening with the community that you may potentially be displacing? Are you providing opportunities for people to actually stay in the communities where they live, age in place, where they've been their entire lives? These are things that people have to think about now, and that communities need to make sure that they're standing up for themselves too, and being educated on and informed on the different ways that they can actually take advantage of either tax breaks in order to stay if all the houses are selling around them and taxes go up, and how do you even afford to even stay there, even if you wanted to. You know, there are just a host of different things you have to think about, but it starts with being informed and being aware of what's going on in your city and being a part of the change instead of having the change happen to you.
And Ashley, you mentioned in your previous statement, you brought up Ruby Bridges and the safety issue of, walking to school. Urban renewal, how does that affect, the safety of individuals and transportation in those neighborhoods?
That's a beautiful segue. And I kind of want to echo what both Timothy and Tanisha have already stated when it comes to how communities, specifically communities of color, can become so disadvantaged due to how the infrastructure is put in place in certain cities when it comes to transportation. And I personally do a lot of work down Lafayette, Murfreesboro Road, and that's a beautiful example of the lack of infrastructure, as well as the lack of resources that the community doesn't have due to where it is placed, where the highway was placed in that community. Let me say that the correct way. And when I say that also is we work with Napier Elementary, but we also have some contacts with Lead and Lead Cameron, specifically. Now, these are two schools that are across the street from each other. And there are some students that actually live and their families reside in the Sudicum community along the University Court. And they struggle to cross the street just to get to their school because the speeds down that particular corridor are 35 to 40 miles an hour per the speed limit. And especially around the morning and lunchtime and then after work, those speeds are elevated significantly, not just for the students, but also for the residents, but also for people who are just trying to get from point A to point B. And even again, to echo something that Timothy said when it comes to green spaces. So one argument that I've stated is that Lafayette keeps the particular community away from a park that's close by that connects it to another resource, which is Dudley Park. That park is less than a mile away, but no one can get there because of the speeds and the unsafety of that particular road. Now, additionally to what Tanisha said about being a part of the change, there are changes that are coming down Chestnut as it turns into Wharf, as it intersects with Charles E. Davis and goes into that same community. And there's so many ways in which residents and citizens of Nashville can be informed with these kinds of projects that are coming down the pipeline because of the fact that they're already in place. They've been in place due to assessments that were done in the past. They're just slow to finally be catching up with where we are now. And so even though that is the case, to be able to be in the flow of what is going on allows you to be able to not only be informed, but inform what's happening.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay. Now we're out of the history. We're moving toward the future. All of us have heard, of course, of Mayor Freddie O'Connell, who's proposed a $3.1 billion plan for public transportation in Nashville. What is included in this plan and why is it important? And this is really to let the public know, because often we read about this part of it, we read about that part. There are some public forums, but there may be some of us that really don't know what he is proposing. I'll start with you, Tanisha.
That's a great question, Sharon, and I can give you a little bit of a teaser, but I highly, highly recommend everyone go check out the nashville.gov, I think it's /transit website to learn more details. But the mayor's plan to address Nashville's most pressing transportation issues, it's called Choose How You Move. And everyone focused on the transit portion of the initiative, but there's like miles of sidewalks, hundreds of traffic signal improvements, and corridor improvements that accommodate different modes of travel. The program is designed to make the transportation system more accessible, more modernized, safer, reliable, and connected. And by doing so, people can have better access to the things that they want to do. So if it's access to jobs, access to education, and just different opportunities, or just being able to just move freely about the cabin. And I think the reason people really need to pay attention to this is in the name of the initiative: choose how you move. It's important because as Nashville continues to grow and opportunities continue to grow around the city, you want to be able to have access to it, whether you have a car or not, whether you have the income to maintain a car and get to where you need to go or not. If you decide you don't want to drive, you want to walk, you want to bike, you want to use transit, it gives you more options in how you move about the city. So in November, voters will have an opportunity to decide whether or not they want to connect the city, this growing city of ours, through sidewalks, signals, and safety. But if anyone has any specific questions about the initiative, they can email, I think it's transit.nashville.gov, or if they want, if they're part of a community group, they can have the Choose How You Move team come to them. You can go to Hub Nashville. I think a lot of people are familiar with Hub Nashville. If you aren't, it's the portal where you can go in and put in a ticket for any issue that you're having, whether it's a sidewalk issue, if there's a pothole, if there's some trash that needs to be removed, just any civic issue that you have, you can go to that portal, Hub Nashville. You can go to the transit section, and then you can ask someone from the transit team to speak at your event. But I highly recommend that people look into this, and this is a part of the informing yourself about what's going on. And if you feel like it's too daunting because it is a large plan, have someone come out to speak to you. Ask the questions that you need to ask, because it definitely would impact how you move around the city.
All right, Ashley, choose how you want to move. What does that mean from your perspective?
For me, choosing how you want to move from my perspective personally is, it's funny, I've never felt more restricted since I moved to Nashville due to the ability to not be able to move. I come from a city where the infrastructure was in the funding, and I rode the bus all the time and worked 3 jobs and went to school and was able to get around because it was there for me to do that. Now here on the other hand, what I can say that I appreciate the Choose How You Move plan is the fact of the sidewalks, service, signals, and safety that they are pushing in this. And even if there aren't sidewalks, we're also going to walk around, right? So let's go back to service, and bus service being not only in existence, but the hours being longer, there being the abilities to be connected to other areas of town. For way too long, the only service has been north and south. And only in the last year have there been the groundbreakings for transit centers to go east and west. I especially got to be at the groundbreaking for the one that was over off of Clarksville Highway. And I was very, very fortunate to have the time to go to that, because and watch it grow. Because I, even standing around, heard some folks say, I'm not going to be able to use this within my lifetime. And here we are. I mean, they've really come a long way with making sure that they not only adhere to what they said, but also to not let down that community any more than it already has been let down. And even when it comes to signals and safety, I mean, complete streets, the 12th South project was a big deal. And the ways in which that there are plans for there to be more examples of that around the city is an even bigger deal, in order to connect communities, in order to connect people to where they need to be and to their resources, but then also that efficiency and safety. Yes, it means that we're going to have to slow down a little bit, but to be able to use your bus, use your car, and use a bike, and use your feet to get within miles of one stretch is not something that Nashville has ever had an opportunity to have. And so the plan, yes, it's a huge plan, but it's something to look forward to because it's something Nashville has never had.
All right. Timothy, tell us some more about this grand plan. That's a lot of money, 3.1 billion, but for transportation, maybe it's not a lot.
3.1 billion is a significant investment of our tax dollars, right? It's a lot of money that's being invested, but as I mentioned earlier in my comments about repairing harm and creating communities of thriving, not just survival in our spaces and in our city, is so critically important. I mean, we talked about the fact that in some areas of our city, even in 2024, we don't have sufficient sidewalks to make our neighborhoods walkable. If you cannot walk safely in your neighborhood or without possibly having to interact with drivers or with dangerous walkways or dangerous areas where it's difficult to be able to circumnavigate, how can we claim that we are in its city? How can we claim that we are an accessible, an equitable city that is investing in infrastructure for all? And so I think that it's a responsible conversation for us to have with members of the community to make sure that their tax dollars are being allocated in ways that they see as appropriate. And I think one good example is that we're finally seeing, as was stated earlier, I believe Ashley was making mention of the fact that we no longer are in a situation where we just can go east and west, I'm sorry, north and south in the city. We'll finally have the ability to be able to reach outer areas in the southeast and the southwest, in communities that have historically been under-resourced and under-invested in, which truly makes us a competitive and international city. We have over 180 languages that are being spoken in the city of Nashville now. And so we're finally seeing signage, seeing information, seeing mobile applications that are around transit, translated into multiple language, thanks to the work of groups like the Tennessee Immigrant Rights and Refugee Coalition. We're finally seeing more investment in sidewalks and in addressing issues of walkability through the work of Walk Bike Nashville. We're seeing the voices of community advocates really being able to be heard in some of these spaces that make decisions around how resources are to be allocated. And I think that that's an example of how we get to a fairer and more equitable system, not just in transit, but as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, all of the things that we are trying to create as a system that makes our community a more welcoming and better place for all people. We do that through civic participation. I'm also really glad as a voting rights advocate that we talked about the fact that in November, we've got elections coming up. So yes, people are talking about what's happening at the top of the ticket in presidential elections and elections as it relates to Congress and all of those things. But where the rubber meets the road, right, is in these local community projects. So if you really want to have your voice heard and you really want to have an influence in how public policy is shaping your neighborhood, is shaping your local community, then it meets the roads at making sure that we allocate resources for sidewalks. It meets the road when we talk about allocating resources in our city government to make sure that we have sufficient lighting in neighborhoods. One of the best ways to reduce the likelihood of nefarious actions happening in neighborhoods is something as innocuous as sufficient lighting in communities. And many of those dollars are allocated based on the needs of population. And a lot of that has to do with transportation and infrastructure. So oftentimes we think of, very large investment projects, highway projects, and things of that nature. But we've got to think more broadly. We've got to think differently. We've got to talk about green space when it comes to things like air quality, which is really critically important as we're building up and investing in the infrastructure of our neighborhoods and communities, that we have sufficient parks and greenways so that children can play safely, but also that we have sufficient methodologies and mitigation processes in place to make sure that we're drinking quality water and we're breathing clean air, because all of those things matter when it comes to the infrastructure of neighborhoods and communities that feel safe and welcoming for all people.
It almost feels as though with this conversation that a plan to fix the transit issue in Nashville should be obvious. A recent Forbes study said that Nashville, believe it or not, has the hardest commute in the country. Now, I don't know all the data that got us there, but anyone that's been in the Nashville area and driven back and forth, even going downtown at certain times of the day, certain slot times, you can go anywhere from 2 o'clock to 8 o'clock, and it's still very, very rough. All of the top 4 hardest commutes were in the South. What has prevented cities in our region from creating public transportation that serves us all? I'll start with you, Tanisha.
There is, I guess, just a baseline of racism, period. Hard stop. Let's start from there. Then we get to all the redlining and everything. If people don't like change. Change in their communities, change in who's living next door to them, change who has access to their neighborhoods. They can change as much as they want to, but they don't want the change to happen unless they're in control of that change. And in the South, we are a car loving community. Yeah. But there's also not just a love of cars, but there's also a disregard for people who don't have a car or don't want to use a car. There's almost seen as a less than type situation, whereas, not having a vehicle, you don't have that maintenance cost. You don't have the car note. You don't have to house a car either at your home or in a parking space somewhere. Giving people an opportunity to have options on how they travel is something that I think is key for any community. The transportation system is a network. And in order for the network to work, you have to have the different pieces within that network. And when you start overburdening one part of the network, you see that congestion and you feel that congestion, and then you get upset about it, but you don't want it to change. You don't want to change your commute. And it's like you have to, when you're in a thriving and growing community, some things are going to change. That's just how it is, point blank. The opportunities come, the jobs come. And when you used to live in Nashville and you had a 15-minute commute, there are a lot of other people who've moved to Nashville now. And that 15-minute commute has gotten a little bit longer because there's so many more people in that typical roadway, that highway or that roadway commute. And instead of them moving to another option, I don't blame them for not moving to the other options right now. They're not as connected as they need to be. They're not as safe as they need to be. Nashville is making a lot of great strides right now to make sure they are safer, they are connected, they are more reliable. It takes time, but people have to realize there has to be some change in order for the community to continue to grow and to continue to thrive.
All right, Ashley, we have, I guess we're on a hard commute. And we've already heard about choose how you want to move. Give us some flavor about those who, as you said, you lived in a place and you got around using transportation. We're going to try to move the needle of these communities that are used to their cars. How do you move the needle? What do we need to do to make that more palatable for them to have these alternative methods of transportation, or use them, that is?
This question was a little tough for me, I'm going to be honest with you. And I say that because I myself have found myself in conversation going, you know what? I thought about riding my bike here today, but I was late, so I chose to drive. And so that in and of itself is a big part of it, is the mentality. And is how, and I love how Tanisha said it, you don't want to change your commute. That mentality, that shift of not only I should leave earlier, but also caring for your fellow human being that's in a vehicle next to you, caring for your fellow human being that's walking along the sidewalk. And I say that as someone who was hit by a car last year, like people caring about their environment and their surroundings, that is the biggest mental shift. And even to something that a former coworker of mine said, that her working here really shifted her mindset on driving the speed limit, not going over, and how you can see so much more when you're not in a hurry, when you are taking your time, when you are able to just kind of be more alert. Now, with that being said, to the point of the question, the infrastructure does not allow us to be able to take this time and to reconsider that humanization. We are constantly on the go. We are constantly on speed limits. We are constantly racing against the clock, for lack of better phrasing, to be able to get done what we need to do in our lives. And it's really funny how transportation is so intertwined into what we need to do our lives. And even like I was saying to someone the other day, goods and services. How else do you expect to get things that you need to have at the grocery store, to have at your school, to do all these things? They have to get from point A to point B somehow, and that's transportation. So what if there's a road that's closed? What if we didn't have railway systems at all anymore? There's so many things that tie to the infrastructure. And in the South specifically, when the infrastructure didn't keep up with the rural areas, we come into these situations where people are forced to move out farther because it's more affordable. And then, say, for example, Nolensville Pike, you have one way in and one way out. And your commute gets elongated even more because the infrastructure was not there to be able to be prepared for that growth, to be prepared for the other methods, to connect to other methods even. I guess my 2 points are infrastructure and a mentality shift.
All right, okay. Next, we're going to discuss a recent Imagine Nashville survey, and many of you hopefully participated in this survey. The 2 main concerns for Nashvillians are developing better transportation options and managing growth. What do mobility and growth have to do with each other? We know there's this growth happening. People want a better method of getting around. They're tired of sitting in their cars for hours on end. How does this affect communities of color? What are we talking about? I'll start with you, Timothy.
Sharon, thank you so much for that question. I'm going to take a moment of personal privilege, though, because the question and the discussion that we were having earlier about, what we can do and how we can vision possibility and how we got here in the first place, I think is a very relevant question and relates to a question that we got earlier about civic participation and engagement in a way that I wanted to be able to address. And so I think that the South got here, right, through a lot of the vestiges of the historic traumas that have been inflicted on communities. We got here as a result of segregation, for example. Some communities were invested in, and there was new infrastructure, new libraries, new housing, all of those things in certain parts of community where folks were wealthy and often white, lived and congregated and worked. And then many of the other areas of the city where individuals who may have had less relative and comparative privilege, who may have had fewer resources in terms of allocation of dollars and investment in other kinds of infrastructure, were often left to their own devices. And so as a result of the separate and unequal distribution of wealth and resources from federal government, state government, and local government agencies, we created an environment through public policy that created a 2-tiered, and in some instances, a multi-tiered system where some communities got investment and others did not. And so that's how we got here in the first place. So we've got to be able to revisit that history, address it, and try to unpack and address the concerns and the impacts of that unequitable distribution of resources and services. But one of the things that we should remember is that human beings, people who live in these communities, who are impacted by these policies, have a voice and have a way to engage in that process so that their voices can be heard. And it looks like things like the Imagine Nashville survey. It looks like making sure that when there are boards and commissions who are meeting to allocate dollars and resources in community, that we inform ourselves about when those meetings are happening, and when there is public comment, we avail ourselves of the opportunity to talk about the issues and concerns that are important to us in community, be they transportation, public safety, or what have you. So we've got to make sure that we are doing what we can as community members to contribute as much as possible to the discourse about the setting of these priorities, and that we are holding accountable those individuals who are elected to serve and to provide adequate access and connection to those resources on our behalf. We're making sure that they're doing that by following what it is that they are publicizing as their priorities, and making sure that those priorities reflect the needs and the concerns of our community members. So I just want to make sure I give a plug to those folks who are not yet registered to vote. The election is coming up in August and November. There's a 30-day requirement that you be registered ahead of those elections to be able to participate. And for those individuals who are just as impacted, who may be outside of the system and unable to engage that process, these surveys through Imagine Nashville, the process of public comment through local community agencies and organizations, engaging the process and uplifting your voices and your stories in community are critically important ways to be civically engaged, whether or not you're able to vote at the voting booth. So we gotta have an all hands on deck kind of approach to how we propose these solutions. And we gotta really be talking about these things and living these principles as a way of life and not just as a mindset. Thinking about transit, thinking about the ways in which our communities can be safer and more connected, thinking about the ways in which we engage processes is a very critical point, but we've got to take that next step of action and engagement. It's our responsibility as civically engaged citizens to inform our neighbors and bring, a few folks with us, either to the polling place or to the protest. We got to make sure that we make this a collaborative and a community effort, because that is the only way that we really change and shift the priorities of those folks who are allocating these tax dollars. I'm going to share just a really brief story that's related to this conversation. We have in our city council races that are decided by less than 25 votes.
That's the truth.
There are more people that are engaged in this conversation today, more people who are watching this playback than actually voted in some of the most recent local elections. We've got to think about the ways in which we galvanize people-powered democracy and engage our communities in ways that uplift the voices of those who have been impacted by these public policies, and we center their needs and concerns. Because if we're really going to have a tide that lifts all boats, we've really got to make sure we plug the holes in the boats that currently exist. Because if you're just raising the tide, you're just drowning more people. We've got to be very honest about how it is that we are prioritizing the needs and concerns of working class and poor and marginalized and minoritized communities, because that's really how we get to a fair and equitable system. That's how we make these systems that are reflecting the needs and concerns of community and really meeting those needs is how it is that we make Nashville the IT city that it purports to be.
All right, I'll go to you, Ashley. Really, this global issue we sum up from in YW terms is mobility justice, because part of our mission statement is justice for all. And we truly, that is part of our mission, and we take that very seriously. But issues of mobility justice have often overlapped with environmental justice. What are some ways communities of color are talking about environmental concerns?
I'd say Walk Bike Nashville specifically has taken a direction of addressing air quality in regard to environmental concerns. And I'd like to tie into that statement how even I myself, when I first moved here, recognized the particular kinds of communities that were along the I-24, I-40, and I-65 portions of the highways. And again, going back to air quality, even for example, Mia House being right there behind the highway system, air quality is the biggest thing. And I believe that communities that are so much closer to highway systems, even in North Nashville, you will see more opportunities of health risks, specifically respiratory, if not in your blood, to be honest with you. And I say that to the extent of how if you've got gardens, if you've got especially vegetation in your gardens, if you've got all kinds of other things, particles can get into that stuff, and you eat that gets into your body. And so, and metals in the air, as I recall, I got to be a part of I got to watch a presentation where they were talking about building a park under the highway system along the Lafayette Murfreesboro Road corridor as you get out of the city. And someone posed a question: have you all tested the soil around that area to even consider if erecting such a thing is safe for the community to be around? And so the again, Walk Bike Nashville has taken a firm direction on looking at how transportation affects air quality, which affects the people of the communities, not only that are by the highways, but then really everywhere. And you'd be impressed if when you pulled up the, say for example, I believe it's called the purple map. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry for misquoting or misnaming what that is, but through the work that we've been doing, you are able to see what the air quality is in certain areas of Nashville. Some schools are actually tracking air quality. I actually know of a couple of breweries that actually track air quality. And these kinds of things are, this particular subject matter is very important when it comes to transportation, because what point do we continue to be so car-centered that our air quality is that of, say, Tokyo or Japan? You know, that's the biggest part.
All right, Tanisha, this issue of mobility justice overlapping with environmental justice, is this something that would be part of the advice that you would give to a city in looking at a transit proposal?
For sure. Just to nerd out just a little bit on what Ashley was talking about. There are like one of the environmental toxins that Ashley was talking about, they call them particulate matters. And cars give off a particular one called PM 2.5. You can't see it, but you're breathing it, and when you're closer to the interstate system or closer to just vehicle exhaust, that gets into your system. And I was listening to a podcast the other day, and you're gonna have to forgive me. I listen to so many, they start running into each other, but I believe it was Hidden Brain. I love Shankar. Just give me some Hidden Brain and I am just like totally nerding out on that too. One of the researchers was talking about, or actually it may have been another one, so forgive me. I'll find it and I'll send it to you guys. But they talked about how PM 2.5, of course, it adversely affects communities of color because we are closer to those larger vehicle exhaust emitter type locations. And it not only affects you in your lungs, it affects the brain. It makes you you become more aggressive, or you can become, you can have a lot of adverse effects, outside of just your lungs. So it's something that's pretty serious that people need to take into account. So when you are out and you're choosing to drive your single occupancy vehicle by yourself, you're impacting your community. When you're out, if there's an option, and I'm not saying that you have to go out and everybody has to go hop on the bus, because I know that is not fully feasible for everyone, or everyone has to hop on the bike. It's not fully feasible for everyone. But when you have an option to choose an alternative mode of transportation, one where it's a more high capacity, you're carrying more people there, so there's less exhaust, you're carrying more people along a corridor, give it a try, because you're impacting the air quality of your community. We've been pretty lucky thus far, where when you're driving on the interstate and you see those variable message signs where they say air quality alert day, don't drive alone, or stay at home if you can, and that impacts all of us, particularly communities of color, but it impacts everyone. And people should not just look at that and be like, oh well, when you cut your grass, that you're releasing those particulates. When you're pumping gas in the middle of the day and it's super hot, that releases those particulates. You have to think about those things. People don't think about it, but there are lots of different ways where you're releasing those particulates into the air, and those particulates are getting inside of our bodies. So when communities are having discussions about air quality, they have to understand that it impacts us all. And it, of course, we're going to draw that line again to transportation. Transportation is one of the larger emitters in urban communities of these particulate matters. So we need to make sure that we are being more mindful of the mode that we choose to travel.
All right. As our time, I always like to give panelists, we always have more questions, and it's such a robust discussion. It's been fabulous. But I always like to give the panelists the opportunity to make a statement. It's almost as if your dream list. If you could pick something that would enhance the mobility or mobility justice of our community, what would that be? I'll start with you, Timothy.
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you again to the panelists who are here today and to the conversation and the questions that were dropped in the chat. It's an honor and a privilege to be here representing the work of community members. And I think more than anything else, what gives me hope, and I think we talk about very heavy topics around transportation, around equity, around justice. But what has given me hope is that what has brought us to this moment, right, is the fact that we, no matter what circumstances we have faced, the kinds of discrimination or marginalization we have experienced, we are resilient as a community. We are resilient as a people. We are resilient as Nashvillians. And there are examples over and over again of people-powered democratic processes changing the status quo and completely transforming elements of our experience. And we can do that again. If we stand together, if we center the needs and concerns of our most vulnerable community members, if we uplift the voices of those who are contributing solutions and not just enumerating problems, we get closer to creating that fairer and more equitable and just society and a greater and better city for all of us. And so that gives me a tremendous amount of hope. And I'm really excited for the work that we're doing locally in community and the ways in which we're uplifting those citizen voices and those community voices to make sure that the priorities that are being reflected in our policies are those that are set by members of our community. We got to continue to do our part and continue to show up on these conversations and others to make sure that we're asking the difficult questions. But I'm very, very hopeful that as we continue to go forward and we set those priorities as community members and we uplift those voices, that we're all contributing our part to make things better. I love what Tanisha said about imagining possibility, visioning what is possible, because these things are possible. What we could not have imagined a few years ago, even before the pandemic, you know, the idea of us having virtual meetings, right? We pivoted, we figured it out, we worked together to make it happen, and now we're here today. And so we need to use that same spirit of innovation and creativity to help power ourselves forward in the transportation solutions of the future. And so, so whatever that looks like for you in your local context, be that, you know, going from driving your car every day to maybe taking public transit or biking or walking to work, or if it just looks like making sure that the policies that are set are ones that are made with you and your involvement in your continued engagement, because there should be nothing about us without us. If it just looks like that for you, then that helps to make the community a better place and helps to make the city a much more representative city for all of us. So I would make that my last word. We're very resilient and we will continue to be. Thank you.
All right, Ashley, you have a magic wand. What's on your wish list for mobility justice? Now, I want you to get into that safety issue, because every time I turn on the TV, I see someone hit by a car, someone hit by this, and you know, it's tough out there.
It really is tough out there. And I think, as I stated, my biggest wish list is for people to consider other people as well as themselves. And in regard to that, because more often than not, even when you see those reports, you see the words, the pedestrian wasn't walking in a crosswalk. That statement right there completely says that it was their fault instead of considering the whole situation. And I think that with that being said, there's so much in regard to certain things. I do want to do a bit of a shameless plug for an organization called Families for Safe Streets. With that being said, they are that particular organization is a really great advocacy organization to get involved in. If you know someone who has been either impacted or if they're just friends with someone, excuse me, let me rephrase that. Whether someone has been impacted via death or just injury, that's what I was trying to say. Families for Safe Streets is a really helpful organization to get involved with. In our Nashville chapter, Darlette Sowers, one thing that she has stated that I just wanted to echo is when you're in your vehicle, is there anything that I should be aware of? Is there anyone that I should be aware of?
And Tanisha, you have that seat at the table. What are you advocating for?
I am advocating for safe streets for all. Whether you walk, you bike, if you're rolling could be wheelchair, rolling could be on whatever. If you are rolling on a bus, if you are rolling in your vehicle, we need better and safer streets for all. We want to make sure that the different options can be accommodated, so people don't have to have that expense of having a vehicle and maintaining a vehicle. We want to make sure that if people need to, if they don't want to catch transit, that they have the option of either being in a car safely or being on a bicycle or walking to where they need to go. We do not take into account the needs of others. Mm-hmm. And we need to start doing that. If it doesn't work for you, think about your neighbors. There are options out there for everyone. And if we can take care of the least among us, the most vulnerable users of our transportation system, then everyone, I promise you, everyone will be okay. I promise you. It's not a slight on anyone who wants to do whatever they want. If we take care of our most vulnerable users, everyone else will be okay.
Oh, what a wonderful conclusion to this conversation. That is absolutely fabulous and absolutely true. I have truly enjoyed the knowledge share that we've had today. Thank you so much for being here. This is such an important conversation. It's a conversation that I hope that those that listen today or listen later will understand. This is a huge issue for our community. And we have to make sure that no one is left behind, because when you spend these dollars and make this commitment, we have to make sure that we advocate for those, as Tanisha said, those who are the most marginalized in our community, those that are most needy in our community. If we take care of those individuals, then everyone will be okay. So thank you so much, and thank you for being part of this truly important conversation. I think we are finished. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.